Every video game tells a story. For most of them, that story is very personal. The N64 that you got for Christmas might have been the first video game console that you owned as a child. Or maybe Pac-Man was the first video game that you remember playing when your parents took you to an arcade for the first time. Those experiences had a powerful impact on many of us and eventually led to a passion for retro gaming. However, some games have a story that is directly connected to the history of video games itself, like a rare development unit or a prototype gaming system. These machines have a link to a pivotal moment in video game history, and the story of their creation helped change the course of the industry. I recently had the opportunity to repair and fully restore this original 1972 Pong arcade machine, and in the process I learned about its unique story. It's a story that's connected to the origins of video games, a story of three men who were pioneers of the early video game and personal computing industries. On this week's episode of Fix It Friday, it's my pleasure to share that story with you for the first time and go into the process of how I restored this historic arcade machine. In the summer of 1966, Ralph Baer was a brilliant engineer that worked for a military contractor known as Sanders Associates. While he was waiting one day at the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan, he had a eureka moment where he envisioned a device that could connect to a television and create interactive games that people of all ages could play. Over the next 3 years, Baer and a few of his colleagues at Sanders had developed a prototype known as the Brown Box. This device connected to a standard black and white TV set, and it came with a set of games, including one called Table Tennis that was designed by his partner, Bill Rush. Sanders Associates and Ralph Baer patented his unique invention, but they needed help to finance, market, and distribute this new product. They shopped around the Brown Box prototype for a few years, and eventually Magnavox was interested and licensed the technology from Sanders and Baer. The device was known as the Magnavox Odyssey, and it was released in September of 1972. It was the first home video game console ever released, and it went on to sell 350,000 units. In that same year of 1972, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney were starting out on their own. They just finished making the first arcade game called Computer Space for a company called Nutting Associates, but it wasn't as successful as they had hoped. The controls were not that intuitive, and as a result, it wasn't that popular. However, the game was successful enough to allow Bushnell and Dabney to start their own company called Atari, with the intent of designing and licensing their games to other manufacturers. Bushnell and Dabney hired a new engineer named Al Alcorn, and Bushnell instructed Alcorn to design a simple tennis game as a training exercise so that he could get familiar with the concept of designing games. Bushnell came up with the idea after he had attended a Magnavox Odyssey promotional event in May of 1972. At the event, Bushnell tried out several of the Odyssey games, including Bill Rush's table tennis game. Bushnell was not impressed with the table tennis game, but he thought that the tennis or ping pong idea was a good one. During the summer of 1972, Alcorn developed the game with Bushnell and Dabney's help, completely unaware of the origins of his training assignment. Alcorn's Pong had appealing sounds as the ball bounced along the screen. It also kept the player's score, and the three men thought that it might have more potential than just as a training exercise. They decided to place a prototype machine in Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale, California, to see how well it would do. A few days later, the owner of the tavern called Alcorn to tell him that the machine had broken down. When Alcorn opened up the prototype machine to investigate, he discovered that it had stopped working because it was overflowing with quarters. Instead of licensing the game, Bushnell and Atari decided to release Pong on their own in November 1972. Pong was the first smash hit in the early history of video games, and Atari went on to sell thousands of cabinets and establish themselves as a major player in the new video game industry. It was the first game to demonstrate that video games could be wildly popular and very profitable. Dozens of Atari's competitors began copying and selling the game, and eventually it made its way into the home with the development of home Pong consoles that were popular all the way until the early 80s. But all of this copying of intellectual property without a licensing agreement was bound to lead to some lawsuits. And eventually, there was bound to be a copyright infringement lawsuit between two of the greatest innovators in the new industry, Magnavox and Atari. In April of 1974, Magnavox filed a patent infringement claim against Atari for the development of Pong. By 1974, Magnavox had seen the success of companies such as Atari that were developing technology that was covered under their Magnavox Odyssey patents, and they decided that it was time to act. They sued Atari, Bally, Midway, Allied Leisure, and others, and the cases were eventually combined into Magnavox versus Bally. Nolan Bushnell and his lawyers believed that they could successfully fend off the patent suit, and Nolan reached out to his friend David Ahl to see if he could help with the lawsuit. David Ahl was an expert in the new industry of video games. He had previously worked at the DEC Corporation, one of the makers of the earliest mainframe computers. Some of the first non-commercial video games like Space War were developed on DEC mainframes at academic institutions, and David had published a newsletter for DEC that published instructions for playing these games on mini-computers. David had left the DEC in 1974 and started his own publication called Creative Computing, which was one of the first magazines that covered the home computer revolution. During the trial, David stated that table tennis video games predated both Atari and Magnavox. He identified William Higginbotham at Brookhaven National Labs in Long Island as the developer of a table tennis game on an oscilloscope known as Tennis for Two. This game was made in 1958, long before the Magnavox Odyssey or Pong were developed. But Higginbotham's game was very different from the Odyssey and Pong in one crucial aspect. It did not require a television to operate, which was a major component of Ralph Baer's original patents. In the end, Atari decided to settle the case with Magnavox out of court. It's estimated that Atari settled for about $400,000 to $1 million. Atari also licensed the technology from Magnavox so that they could continue to make Pong and other video games that were tied to the patents. At the time, Atari was still a new company, and so Nolan Bushnell offered to pay David with a Pong arcade machine instead of with cash. David agreed, and a new Pong arcade was manufactured and delivered to his doorstep. Every Pong arcade is special because of this game's historic significance, but this particular arcade has a direct link to Nolan Bushnell, David Ahl, Atari, and the early history of video games. This Pong arcade machine remained in David's collection until it was recently acquired by a collector in April of 2019. It had been reduced down to just a control panel and a game PCB, and it was no longer working. In August of 2019, this arcade was given to the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo in the hope that we could repair and restore it. Check in for part 2 of this Fix It Friday, where we go into the details of the repair and restoration of this historic game. Even better, this historic Pong arcade is available for you to play right now at the Cradle of Aviation Museum in Garden City, New York, from February 15th to April 19th. So stop on by and check it out.